This is my true story. I spent my whole life working so my son could live better than I ever did. I gave him food, a home, and every chance to succeed. I thought when I grew old, he would give me love in return. But one day, during a family gathering, he looked me in the eye and called me a beggar in front of everyone. The room filled with laughter while I sat in silence, broken inside. My heart cracked, but I was not powerless. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. A father's sacrifice is not always seen in big things. Sometimes it is in the quiet choices made every single day. My life was built on sacrifice for my son. From the moment he was born, my path was no longer my own. I worked long hours, day and night, in the fields and in the factory, saving every dollar I could. I denied myself rest, I denied myself new clothes, I denied myself comfort, because I wanted him to grow up with more than I ever had. I built the family home brick by brick, not with machines or help, but with my own 2 hands. Every nail hammered, every wall raised, every corner shaped. All of it came from my sweat. While others bought houses, I built mine, dreaming that it would shelter my family for generations. I pictured my son walking through those doors, safe, proud, and secure. I told myself, this house will stand for him even when I am gone. When he was young, I made sure he never felt hunger. Even on nights when food was little, I always gave him the bigger share. I would tell him I wasn't hungry, even when my stomach ached with emptiness. I worked overtime shifts so I could buy him school uniforms and books. I walked miles so he could take the bus. I wanted him to be respected among his classmates, never mocked for being poor. When debts came, I paid them. When he struggled, I carried him. When he wanted more, I gave more. I sold pieces of land to pay for his higher education. I used up savings I had kept for my old age to cover his wedding expenses. Every dollar I had earned, every coin I had saved, I poured into his future. Not once did I ask him to repay me. Not once did I expect him to serve me. All I wanted was respect, a simple thank you, and care in my last years. I remember the day of his wedding. He stood tall, dressed well, smiling as he began his new life. I watched with pride, tears in my eyes. I thought, all of this is worth it. All my years of labor, all my sleepless nights, all my sacrifices, they were worth it, because he will now build his own family, and he will honor me for giving him this start. That belief carried me for years. But dreams do not always match reality. My sacrifices, instead of bringing gratitude, began to fade from his memory. The house I built became something he believed was always his, not something given. The money I spent on him became something he thought he deserved, not something I worked for. And slowly, the respect I had hoped for was replaced with arrogance. Still, I endured. I told myself that a father's duty is to give, not to take. I told myself that love would return one day. I told myself that patience was all I needed. But deep inside, I began to feel the weight of disappointment. Sacrifice without respect is like building a house on sand. No matter how strong the walls, it will one day fall. And my house of sacrifice, the life I built for him, was already shaking. Cruelty does not appear suddenly like lightning. It grows slowly, like weeds in a garden. At first, you do not see it, or you choose to ignore it. That is how it was with my son. The first signs of cruelty were small, almost hidden, but they carried pain all the same. His tone began to change. When he was younger, he used to speak with respect, calling me father with warmth in his voice. But as the years passed, the warmth turned cold. The word father sounded heavy, impatient, as if saying it was a chore. When I asked him for little things, like passing me a glass of water or helping me with the door, his sighs were loud and sharp. It was not what he said, but how he said it, that stung me the most. Then came the way he looked at me. A son should look at his father with pride or care, but his eyes often carried irritation. If my hands trembled while eating, he smirked. If I walked slower than him, he mocked me, saying, "Hurry up, old man." At first I tried to laugh along, pretending it was harmless teasing, but deep inside, it hurt. Every joke chipped away at the respect I thought I had earned through my sacrifices. Over time, the jokes became insults. If I reminded him to be careful with money, he would snap, "You know nothing about today's world." If I shared a story from my younger days, he would roll his eyes and say, "Stop repeating yourself." His wife often stood by in silence, never defending me, sometimes even smiling at his words. That silence told me more than any insult. It told me she agreed with him. It did not stop there. The kindness I once received turned into demands. He no longer asked me with courtesy. He ordered me. "Sit here. Don't touch that. Stay out of this." The house I built with my hands, brick by brick, no longer felt like mine. I was a guest in my own home, treated not as a father but as an unwanted burden. I endured it all in silence. I told myself he was stressed, that life's pressures were making him harsh. I told myself he would change. But the truth was clear. Respect had left his heart, and in its place grew arrogance. Each insult was a warning. Each smirk was a sign. But I closed my eyes to them, because no father wants to believe that his own son has turned cruel. The first signs of cruelty may seem small, but they are heavy when carried in the heart. And my heart was already heavy, weighed down by the slow loss of love I once thought would last forever. The cruel act came on a day that should have been filled with family, food, and togetherness. It was a family gathering, a time when relatives, cousins, and grandchildren all came together under one roof. The house was full of voices, laughter, and the smell of food cooking in the kitchen. I sat quietly in the corner, watching the young ones run around, smiling softly as I remembered when my son was their age. My heart felt heavy, but I told myself at least I could still see family around me. As the meal was served, everyone gathered at the long table. Plates clattered, cups were filled, and conversations mixed with laughter. I reached for a small piece of bread, my hands trembling as they often did now in my old age. And then, without warning, my son's voice cut through the noise. Loud, sharp, and cold. He looked straight at me and said, "You sit there like a beggar." For a moment, silence fell. Every eye in the room turned toward me. His words hung in the air, heavy like a stone. My heart stopped, and I felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on my chest. A beggar. That is what he called me. Not father, not elder, not man of respect, but beggar. And then the laughter came. His wife smirked, covering her mouth as if to hide her amusement. Some relatives chuckled awkwardly, unsure of what else to do. Even a few grandchildren laughed, not understanding the cruelty of the word, but following the sound of others. I sat frozen, my head lowered, my eyes staring at the plate in front of me. I could not speak. I could not move. My heart was breaking in silence. I thought of the nights I skipped meals so he would not go hungry. I thought of the coins I saved, the debts I paid, the sweat I gave to build the very table he now sat at with pride. And yet, in front of the whole family, he stripped me of my dignity with one word: beggar. That word was sharper than any slap, colder than any shove, heavier than any burden I had carried. No one defended me. No one stopped him. His voice was too strong, his pride too high, and their silence too heavy. I realized in that moment that I was alone, even in a room full of family. Alone in my shame. Alone in my pain. Alone in the very house I had built with my own hands. I lowered my head further, hiding the tears that began to fill my eyes. I forced myself to eat in silence, though each bite tasted like dust. Around me, laughter slowly returned, conversations resumed, but the word echoed in my mind again and again: beggar. That was the cruel act. Not just the insult, but the joy he took in saying it, the pride in his voice, the smirk on his wife's face, the laughter of those who should have stood by me. That day, something inside me changed forever. Humiliation is not always loud. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a shadow that follows you even when no one else notices. That is what I carried after that family gathering. My son's word, beggar, stayed in my chest long after the laughter in the room had faded. It echoed in my ears when the night grew quiet. It burned in my heart when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. And though no one spoke of it again, I could still feel their eyes, their silence, their judgment. I remember sitting at the table that day, my hands resting on my knees, my eyes fixed on the plate in front of me. Everyone around me ate and laughed as if nothing had happened. But for me, the world had changed. The food on my plate felt heavy, tasteless. My hands trembled, not because of age, but because of shame. I did not lift my head. I did not defend myself. I let the word beggar settle like dust over my body, covering me in silence. Inside, I wanted to shout. I wanted to remind them of the nights I went hungry so my son could eat. I wanted to tell them how I carried him on my shoulders when his legs were weak, how I gave him my shoes when his feet were bare, how I worked when my body begged for rest just so he could sleep in comfort. I wanted to remind him that beggars take without giving, but I had given him everything I had. Yet, I said nothing. My lips stayed closed because I knew if I spoke, my voice would shake, and he would only laugh louder. When the gathering ended, relatives left with full stomachs and empty words. No one came to me. No one said, "You do not deserve that." They left me in silence, just as my son had left me in humiliation. I walked to my room slowly, each step heavy, as if my legs carried not only my body, but also the weight of insult. That night, I sat alone in the dark. I did not cry loudly, but my eyes filled with tears that slipped quietly down my cheeks. I thought of my wife, long gone, and wished she were there. She would have stood up for me. She would have silenced his cruelty. But she was not there, and I was alone. My only company was the echo of his voice calling me beggar, and the silence of those who let it pass. Humiliation in silence cuts the deepest. A slap leaves a mark, but words spoken in front of family leave scars no one can see. I had carried many burdens in my life, poverty, hunger, hard labor, but none had weighed as heavily as that single word spoken by the son I had sacrificed everything for. And yet, in that silence, something began to change. Shame turned slowly into thought. Pain began to harden into resolve. If my son could call me a beggar in the house I built, then he had forgotten the truth. And it was time I reminded him, not with words, not with anger, but with the quiet power he had overlooked. My son thought that by calling me a beggar, he had stripped me of all worth. He believed that the word alone could erase my years of sacrifice, my role as his father, and the respect I deserved. He thought power was in the laughter of others, in the strength of his voice, in the way he stood tall while I sat in silence. But he forgot something important. Real power does not sit in insults. Real power is quiet. It hides in the things you own, the names on papers, the keys to doors, the signatures that decide the future. When I sat alone in my room that night, humiliated and broken, I thought of this truth. He called me a beggar, but who owned the house we sat in? Who built the walls with his own hands? Who signed the deeds that kept it standing in my name? It was me, not him. Every brick, every corner, every window of that home belonged to me. He might sit at the head of the table and laugh, but the table itself was mine. He believed his strength came from youth, from the family gathered around him, from the silence of his wife as she smirked at my pain. But strength without control is nothing. He could raise his voice, but he could not raise a single document that proved ownership. He could laugh with pride, but he could not laugh away the truth of the law. His future still rested in my hands. I realized then that he had confused dignity with weakness. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought my patience meant defeat. But I was not defeated. I was waiting. And while he mocked me as a beggar, I knew that I was still the master of the house, the land, and the legacy. He had forgotten that the man he humiliated was still the one who held the pen that could take everything away from him. I thought about all the property papers locked safely away, my savings, my accounts, the will I had not yet signed over. All of it was untouched. All of it was mine. My son lived with the belief that he already owned it, that one day it would pass to him naturally. That belief gave him arrogance. But arrogance is blind. He forgot that until the day I signed my name, none of it belonged to him. That realization lit a fire inside me. I remembered the sacrifices I had made, the nights I worked, the years I gave. I remembered how I built a future, not for myself, but for him. And now, I saw that the only way to protect my dignity was to take back what he thought was guaranteed. He thought calling me a beggar would leave me powerless. But the truth was, the beggar he mocked was the master of his fate. That night, after everyone had left the gathering, I sat alone in my room. The word beggar still rang in my ears. I could hear the echo of laughter. I could see the smirk on my son's face. I could feel the weight of silence from the family who watched me without saying a word. My heart was heavy, but my mind was clear. That was the night I made my decision. Enough was enough. I had given him my time, my health, my money, my life. I had built a home not for myself, but for him. I had carried him on my shoulders when he was too small to walk. I had stayed hungry so he could eat. I had worked through pain so he could rest in comfort. And yet, he repaid me with humiliation. He used my sacrifices as weapons against me. He turned the home I built into a stage for his insults. That night, I decided he would have nothing more from me. I sat in silence, but inside me, the silence began to harden. No more patience. No more waiting for respect that would never come. No more hoping he would change. The boy I raised was gone. The man who stood before me was arrogant, cruel, and unworthy of my legacy. And if he thought I would hand him the keys to the future, he was mistaken. I looked around the house, every wall filled with memories. I remembered laying the first brick, telling myself it would be for my family's safety. I remembered my wife, now gone, helping me paint the walls, smiling at the life we were building together. I remembered holding my son as a baby in these very rooms, believing he would one day honor me. But instead, in these same walls, he called me beggar. The thought burned in my chest. My wife would never forgive me if I let this insult pass without action. So, I decided I would cut him off completely. I would take from him the one thing he valued most: the house, the property, the inheritance he thought was already his. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the family, then I would humiliate him in front of life itself. He would wake up one day and discover that the very ground beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. The pride in his voice would turn to silence. The arrogance in his walk would turn to shame. This was not a decision born from anger alone. It was born from justice. A father should not have to beg for respect in the home he built. A father should not be mocked by his own blood. And so I told myself, let strangers have my property. Let charities hold my name. Let neighbors inherit my work. Anyone but him. I would rather give my life's work to people who respected me than leave it to a son who called me a beggar. By the time the night turned to dawn, my decision was final. My heart no longer trembled with shame. It beat steady with resolve. My son thought he had broken me with a single word. But in truth, he had only awakened the strength I had buried for too long. And with that strength, I was ready to act. A decision without action is only a thought. I knew if I wanted justice, I had to act quickly. My son believed he had all the time in the world. He believed that no matter how he treated me, the house, the property, and the savings would eventually fall into his hands. He walked with that arrogance. He spoke with that pride. But he had forgotten one truth. Nothing belonged to him yet. It was still all mine. And now, I was ready to take it away. The very next morning, I rose early. The house was quiet. My son and his wife were still asleep, resting peacefully in the home they thought would always be theirs. I put on my old coat, gathered the documents I kept safe, and walked out the door without a word. Each step I took away from that house was a step toward freedom, toward dignity, toward justice. I went to see my lawyer, a man I had known for many years. He had seen me work, he had seen me struggle, and he had always treated me with respect. When I sat in his office, he noticed the sadness in my eyes, but also the strength behind them. I told him everything, The insults, the gathering, the moment my son called me a beggar in front of the family. I spoke slowly, but my voice was firm. I was not asking for advice, I was giving instructions. I want everything changed, I told him. Sell the house. Remove his name. Make sure he gets nothing. My lawyer leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. Are you certain? He asked. This is final. Once you sign, there is no going back. I nodded without hesitation. I am certain. I would rather give everything I have to strangers than leave a single coin for the one who mocked me as a beggar. And so the work began. Papers were brought out, deeds were placed on the table, and signatures were required. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age. Yet with each stroke of the pen, my heart grew steadier. Each signature was a piece of my dignity returned to me. Each line I signed erased his arrogance a little more. The house was sold. The money was transferred into my account under my name alone. The will was rewritten. My son's name was removed completely. He was no longer my heir. He was no longer the future of my property or my legacy. His arrogance had built a castle in the air, and with one morning of signatures, I tore it down. When it was done, my lawyer placed his hand on mine. You've done the right thing, he said softly. I nodded, not out of pride, but out of peace. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my life again. I walked out of that office into the daylight with a calm heart. The air felt lighter. The streets seemed brighter. I was no longer a man waiting for respect that would never come. I was a man who had taken his respect back with his own hands. At home, my son still sat in ignorance, still believing he was master of the future. He did not know that with the scratch of a pen, his world had already changed. The house he laughed in no longer belonged to him. The property he bragged about to his friends was gone. His name, once written in my will, had been erased forever. The execution of my plan was complete. My son thought calling me a beggar had left me powerless, but in truth, it had given me the strength to act. And with quiet signatures, I had taken everything back. The fallout did not come immediately. For a few days, my son still lived in pride. He walked through the house as if it was already his. He sat in the chair at the head of the table, speaking loudly, bragging to relatives about the future he believed was secure. His wife smiled beside him, nodding as if she already owned everything I had worked for. They did not know that while they laughed, the ground under their feet had already shifted. The first crack appeared when the lawyer's letter arrived. I was not there to see it, but I can imagine the moment. My son, sitting comfortably, opened the envelope with casual hands. But when his eyes moved across the words, his face must have changed. His name was gone. The house, the property, the inheritance he counted on. None of it belonged to him. The will had been rewritten. The house was sold. The money was no longer tied to his future. In one letter, his pride was shattered. His wife must have asked him what it meant. Relatives must have whispered behind his back. Neighbors began to talk. The old man sold the house. The son was cut out. The beggar has become the master. Their words reached his ears, each one heavier than the last. The man who once laughed at me now walked through the streets with lowered eyes. The respect he thought he owned turned into shame. At home, the air grew tense. His wife, who once smirked at my humiliation, now turned her anger toward him. How could you let this happen? She must have asked. How could you lose everything? Their arguments filled the rooms that were no longer theirs. Pride turned into panic. Laughter turned into shouting. The walls that once echoed with their arrogance now shook with their fear. My phone began to light up with calls. 1 call, 10 calls, dozens of calls. He begged to speak with me, to understand, to undo what had been done. But I did not answer. Each unanswered ring was justice. Each silence was my reply. The same silence he gave me in front of the family when he called me a beggar, I now gave him in his downfall. Bills began to rise. Without the house, without the property, without inheritance, his security vanished. Debts that I once cleared for him now stood tall in front of him, demanding payment. The luxuries he enjoyed began to disappear. His friends, the same ones who laughed with him, turned away. They did not want to sit beside a man who had lost everything, a man who was cut out by his own father. Loneliness began to eat at him the way humiliation once ate at me. The fallout was complete. He had mocked me before the whole family, stripping me of dignity. But now the world stripped him of pride. He had called me a beggar, but now he was the one left begging, not for food, but for answers, for forgiveness, for the future he had thrown away. And I, the father he thought was powerless, had left him with nothing. The aftermath spread slowly, like smoke after a fire. It did not explode in one day, but it crept into every corner of my son's life. Relatives who once smiled at him now turned their faces away. They remembered the night he called me a beggar in front of them. They remembered his laughter, his arrogance, his pride. Now those same relatives whispered, "The beggar was not the father. The beggar is the son." Their words carried through the town like wind, and my son could not escape them. His friends also changed. When he had wealth, they filled his house. They ate his food, drank his wine, and laughed at his jokes. But when news spread that the house was sold, that the inheritance was gone, they left. Empty chairs filled the rooms. Silence replaced the noise of gatherings. His phone, once ringing with invitations, now only rang with debt collectors and my unanswered calls. At home, his wife grew restless. She had married him for comfort, for the promise of a house, land, and a future built on my sacrifice. But now all of that was gone. Her smile vanished. Her words turned sharp. Fights filled the nights. "Your father destroyed us," she screamed. "You promised me security, and now we have nothing." Her anger was a mirror of his cruelty to me. He had once mocked me for being weak, but now he was mocked in his own home for being powerless. My son tried to stand tall, but his pride crumbled piece by piece. He visited banks, begging for loans. He asked relatives for help, but they turned him away. They said, "If you could treat your father like dirt, why should we trust you?" Each door closed in his face was another punishment. The respect he once demanded was now denied to him at every step. The nights were the worst for him. I know because neighbors spoke about hearing his shouts, his arguments, his despair. He had once slept soundly, believing his future was secure. But now, each night was filled with tossing, turning, and the weight of fear. His arrogance was gone. His laughter was gone. Only silence and shame remained. Meanwhile, I lived in peace. Far from the house where he mocked me, I found quiet. I no longer had to hear cruel words or see cold faces. I no longer had to sit at a table where I was humiliated. My meals were small but full of dignity. My nights were simple but full of rest. The peace I carried was heavier than gold because it was bought with justice. The aftermath was clear. His life fell apart, while mine finally found freedom. He had thought pushing me down in front of family would bury me in shame, but it buried him instead. His arrogance was the rope he tied around his own neck. His cruelty was the hammer that smashed his own future. And I, the father he laughed at, was the one who cut the rope and walked away free. Grandpa's justice was not loud. It was not with shouting, not with fists, not with revenge and anger. It was silent, calm, and final. I did not need to push him. I did not need to strike him. I did not need to answer his 42 calls. My justice was stronger than words. It came with a pen, with papers, with choices that could not be undone. He had mocked me before the family, called me a beggar, laughed as if I was nothing. But now he was the one who walked through the streets with bowed head, while I walked in peace, free from shame. I found a small place far away from the town, where no one called me names, where no one ordered me around. There, I lived in quiet. I ate meals with dignity, even if they were simple. I slept on a clean bed, not on the floor. No one pushed me, no one mocked me, no one laughed when I spoke. The silence of peace was sweeter than the noise of cruelty. Every morning when I opened my eyes, I remembered that I had taken back control of my life. I was no longer his servant. I was no longer trapped in humiliation. I was free. My son, on the other hand, was left with nothing. No house, no inheritance, no respect. The family name he once carried with pride now tasted bitter in his mouth. Relatives no longer wanted to be connected to him. Neighbors who once envied him now pitied him. His wife, who had smiled when he mocked me, now frowned at him with disgust. The same people who laughed with him now whispered about his downfall. And every time he looked at his phone, the silence of my unanswered calls reminded him that he was the beggar now. Justice, for me, was not about revenge, it was about balance. He thought power came from humiliating me. But real power came from patience, from endurance, from waiting for the right moment to act. He pushed me into the dirt, but I rose. He called me a beggar, but I proved I was the master. He laughed at my pain, but in the end, the world laughed at his ruin. My justice was simple. I gave my legacy to those who respected life, not to cruelty. My house, my land, my savings, they went to strangers who would honor them, not to a son who tried to bury me in shame. In the end, I was at peace. I had no anger left in me, only calm. My life's work was not wasted. My sacrifices were not in vain. I chose where my legacy would live, and it was not in the hands of cruelty. He thought he could erase my dignity, but I erased his future instead. And with every breath of quiet freedom, I knew justice had been served. Final thought. He called me a beggar before the whole family, but I sold the house, I cut him out, and I left him with nothing. My silence was my answer, and my justice was forever.